The Sister from Normandy, Act I. June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks over the coast of Normandy, France. But this is not an ordinary dawn. The sky is filled with aircraft, thousands of them, their engines creating a sound like sustained thunder rolling across the English Channel. Ships crowd the water, more vessels than anyone has ever seen in one place, stretching to the horizon in every direction. This is D-Day. Operation Overlord. The largest amphibious invasion in human history. And on the beaches below, hell is about to be unleashed. Colette Rousseau stands in the doorway of a small stone house in the village of Saint-Mireglise, watching the sky fill with parachutes. White silk blossoms falling like strange flowers, carrying men down through the pre-dawn darkness. American paratroopers, dropping behind German lines hours before the beach landings begin. Some land safely in fields. Others tangle in trees, hang helpless, are shot by German soldiers before they can cut themselves free. One parachutist lands directly on the church steeple in the village square, his parachute catching on the bell tower, leaving him suspended there, playing dead while German soldiers rush past below. Colette is 26 years old, a registered nurse before the war, now working as a volunteer medic for the French resistance. She has lived through 4 years of German occupation, 4 years of oppression, fear, collaboration, and resistance. Her village sits in a strategic location near the coast, occupied by German troops who have fortified every building, every crossroad, every possible defensive position. The Germans know the invasion is coming. They have known for months. They simply do not know when or where. Now they know. Now the war has come to Normandy. The house where Colette stands belonged to her family. Her parents owned it, raised her and her brother here, lived quiet lives as farmers and shopkeepers. But her parents are dead now, killed 2 years ago during a British bombing raid that targeted the nearby German ammunition depot. The bombs missed their target, hit the village instead. Her mother died instantly, crushed under collapsed masonry. Her father survived 3 days, then succumbed to internal injuries. Colette buried them in the village cemetery, 2 more civilian casualties in a war that consumes everything it touches. Her brother, Jacques, he died differently. He joined the resistance in 1942, part of a network that sabotaged German supply lines, gathered intelligence for the Allies, helped down pilots escape to neutral territory. The Gestapo caught him in early 1943. They tortured him for information, broke his body systematically, professionally. Jacques never talked, never betrayed his comrades. The Gestapo executed him anyway, shot him in the courtyard of the local German headquarters, left his body hanging as a warning to other would-be resistors. Colette has lived with rage ever since. Cold, controlled rage that never diminishes, never fades. She joined the resistance after Jacques died, not for ideology or patriotism, but for revenge. She wanted Germans to suffer. She wanted to hurt them, kill them, make them pay for her brother, her parents, her stolen life. The resistance welcomed her. Nurses were valuable, rare, desperately needed. Fighters got wounded. They needed treatment but could not go to hospitals where German authorities monitored admissions. Colette provided that treatment, secretly, working from hidden locations, treating gunshot wounds and injuries without anesthesia or proper equipment. She learned to work with almost nothing. Boiled water and stolen bandages. Black market antibiotics when available, prayer when they were not. She removed bullets with kitchen knives sterilized over fire. She stitched wounds with sewing thread. She set broken bones using wooden planks as splints. Men screamed during these procedures, bit down on leather straps, passed out from pain. Many died anyway, from infection, from blood loss, from complications she lacked resources to treat. But some survived. Some lived because of her improvised care. Those survivors went back to fighting. Colette sent them back, knowing they would be wounded again, knowing she would treat them again, knowing the cycle would continue until someone died. The invasion changes everything. The resistance has been waiting for this moment, preparing for it, receiving instructions from Allied command through coded BBC radio broadcasts. When the invasion begins, resistance networks across France are to activate, attacking German communications, sabotaging railroads, ambushing supply convoys, creating chaos behind enemy lines to support the Allied advance. Colette's network received their orders last night. Targets assigned, weapons distributed, final preparations made. Today they fight openly, no longer in shadows but as auxiliary forces supporting the liberation. But Colette has different orders. The local resistance commander, a former schoolteacher named Antoine, he pulled her aside yesterday evening, spoke to her privately. The invasion will create massive casualties, he explained. Allied casualties on the beaches, German casualties from naval bombardment, civilian casualties caught in crossfire. The wounded will be everywhere, hundreds of them, thousands. Regular medical services will be overwhelmed, insufficient, unable to cope with the scale of carnage. The resistance needs Colette to establish a medical station, somewhere behind Allied lines once the beachhead is secured, somewhere she can treat wounded soldiers who cannot wait for evacuation to proper hospitals. Antoine gave her supplies. Morphine stolen from a German medical depot. Bandages, sulfa powder, surgical instruments, plasma if she can keep it from freezing. Not enough supplies, never enough, but more than she has ever had before. He gave her a map, marked with a farmhouse 2 kilometers inland from Omaha Beach, the codenamed sector where American forces will land. The farmhouse belongs to a sympathizer, a widow who has agreed to shelter the medical station. Colette is to reach that farmhouse, set up operations, and treat wounded as they arrive. It is a simple mission. It is also nearly impossible. The route to the farmhouse crosses German defensive positions, minefields, machine gun nests, artillery emplacements. The Germans will be fighting desperately to contain the invasion. Moving through that battlefield will mean constant danger, constant exposure to fire. And once she reaches the farmhouse, if she reaches it, she will be treating Allied soldiers, marking herself as a legitimate military target. The Germans do not respect medical neutrality. They bomb hospitals, shoot medics, consider anyone helping the enemy as an enemy themselves. Antoine asked if she would do this. Colette did not hesitate. Yes. Of course yes. This is what she has been preparing for, what all her rage and grief have been building toward. A chance to save lives, to actively fight the Germans, to be part of liberation rather than occupation. She took the supplies, studied the map, memorized the route. She spent the night preparing, packing equipment, writing a letter to be delivered if she dies. The letter is addressed to no one in particular, just a record of what she has done, why she did it, what she hoped to accomplish. She sealed it, left it on the table in her house. If she does not return, perhaps someone will find it, perhaps someone will remember. Dawn comes. The sky fills with planes and parachutes. Distant explosions begin, naval guns firing from ships offshore, massive shells screaming inland to hit German fortifications. The bombardment is overwhelming, unceasing, the loudest sound Colette has ever heard. The ground shakes with each impact. Windows rattle. Dust falls from ceiling beams. This is what Allied might sounds like, the full industrial power of America and Britain directed at liberating France. Colette gathers her supplies, straps the medical pack to her back, checks her papers one final time. She carries identification documents provided by the resistance, marking her as a civilian medical volunteer. The documents are legitimate, properly forged, will withstand cursory inspection. They will not save her if the Germans decide she is a combatant. But they might help with Allied forces, might identify her as friendly, might prevent nervous soldiers from shooting her on sight. She steps outside. The village is chaos. German soldiers are running toward defensive positions, officers shouting orders, vehicles racing toward the coast. Civilians hide in cellars, in churches, in any structure offering protection from bombardment. Colette moves against the flow, walking deliberately away from the village, toward the sound of battle, toward the beach where men are dying in numbers impossible to comprehend. She follows hedgerows, staying low, using terrain for cover. The Norman countryside is a maze of small fields divided by ancient hedges, thick vegetation growing atop earth mounds that form natural walls. These hedgerows provide concealment but also create countless hiding places for German defenders. Every field could contain machine gun nests, every hedge could hide snipers. Colette moves carefully, slowly, watching for movement, listening for sounds of enemy soldiers. She encounters her first casualties within 15 minutes. 3 American paratroopers, lying in a ditch beside a narrow road. 2 are clearly dead, their bodies twisted, their parachutes tangled around them. The third is alive, conscious, clutching his leg where blood soaks through his uniform. He sees Colette, raises a pistol with shaking hands, aims at her. She stops, raises her hands, speaks in accented English. "I am a nurse." French. "I can help you." The paratrooper keeps the pistol pointed at her, his face pale with shock and blood loss. He is young, impossibly young, perhaps 19 years old. His helmet is gone, his face smeared with mud and blood. He looks at her with wide, terrified eyes, trying to determine if she is threat or salvation. Colette does not move. She waits, letting him decide, letting him see that she carries medical supplies, that her hands are empty, that she means no harm. Slowly, the paratrooper lowers his weapon. He nods, a small movement, permission granted. Colette approaches, kneels beside him, examines his leg. The wound is bad, a bullet through the calf, possibly shattered bone. He needs surgery, proper hospital care. But he will bleed to death before reaching any hospital. She can stabilize him, stop the bleeding, give him a chance. She works quickly, efficiently, cutting away his trouser leg, exposing the wound. The bullet passed through cleanly, exited the other side. Good. No bullet to extract. She packs the wound with gauze, applies pressure until bleeding slows. She injects morphine from her precious supply, watches as the drug takes effect, as his face relaxes slightly, as pain recedes to manageable levels. She bandages the leg tightly, splints it with branches cut from the hedgerow. Basic field medicine, crude but effective. The paratrooper watches her work. He tries to speak, to thank her, but words do not come easily. Colette shushes him gently, finishes the bandaging, checks his pulse. Rapid but strong. He will survive if infection does not set in, if he receives proper care within a day or 2. She leaves him with a canteen of water, tells him to stay hidden, promises that medics will come looking for casualties once the beachhead is secured. She continues moving inland. The sounds of battle intensify with every step. Machine guns chattering, rifles cracking, explosions from mortars and artillery shells. She is moving toward hell itself, toward the beach where thousands of men are landing under withering fire. Logic says to turn back, to find shelter, to wait until the battle moves past. But Colette does not turn back. She has a mission. Men are dying ahead. She must reach the farmhouse, establish the medical station, do what she can to save whoever can be saved. She encounters more casualties. A group of American soldiers pinned down by German machine gun fire, 2 of them wounded, unable to move. Colette crawls through a drainage ditch, reaches them, begins treatment under fire. Bullets snap overhead, kicking up dirt, ricocheting off stones. The soldiers stare at her in disbelief. What is a French woman doing here, in the middle of a firefight, calmly bandaging wounds while Germans try to kill everyone? She does not explain. She works, treats the wounded, injects morphine, stops bleeding. One of the soldiers, a sergeant, demands she leave, insists it is too dangerous, orders her to retreat to safety. Colette ignores him. She is not under his command. She is not a soldier. She is a nurse, and wounded men need treatment. The sergeant gives up arguing, instead provides covering fire while she works, shooting at German positions to suppress their fire, buying her time to finish bandaging. She leaves the soldiers, continues toward the farmhouse. She is closer now, perhaps 1 kilometer remaining. But the fighting is everywhere, impossible to avoid. German and American units clashing in hedgerows, in fields, in villages. Artillery shells falling randomly, churning earth, destroying buildings, killing without discrimination. Colette moves through this chaos like a ghost, somehow untouched, somehow surviving when death surrounds her on every side. She reaches a small crossroads and stops. A German machine gun position blocks the direct route to the farmhouse. 3 soldiers manning an MG-42, the weapon that fires so rapidly it sounds like tearing cloth, that kills with horrifying efficiency. They have excellent positions, good fields of fire, are systematically mowing down American soldiers trying to advance up the road. Bodies lie scattered in front of the position, some dead, some wounded and calling for help, all of them beyond reach because anyone who tries to rescue them gets shot. Colette cannot proceed this way. She must find another route, circle around the German position, approach the farmhouse from a different direction. But as she prepares to withdraw, she hears screaming. One of the wounded Americans lying in the road, a boy with his legs shattered, is crying for his mother, begging for help, terrified and dying alone. The sound tears at Colette's heart, strips away tactical considerations, leaves only human response to suffering. She makes a decision. An insane decision. She stands up, fully visible, raises her hands showing she is unarmed, walks directly toward the German machine gun position. The Germans see her immediately, swing their weapon toward her, shout commands in harsh German. Halt. Stop. She keeps walking, slowly, deliberately, hands raised. She calls out in French, then German, identifying herself as a medical volunteer, explaining she wants to treat the wounded men lying in the road. The German soldiers are confused. This is not normal battlefield behavior. Enemy soldiers do not simply walk up to machine gun nests with hands raised. They do not ask permission to treat casualties. But Colette is clearly not a soldier. She wears civilian clothes, carries medical supplies, is obviously female, obviously unarmed. The Germans hesitate, uncertain what to do, whether to shoot her or let her pass. An officer appears, a young lieutenant who speaks some French. He questions Colette sharply, demands to see her identification papers, asks what she thinks she is doing walking through a battlefield. She explains calmly, shows her papers, repeats that she wants to treat wounded men. The lieutenant studies her, trying to determine if this is some allied trick, some elaborate deception. But what trick could it be? She is one woman with bandages and morphine. She poses no military threat. The lieutenant makes a decision. He allows her to proceed, to treat the wounded Americans lying in the road, under one condition. She must also treat German wounded. Medical care for both sides, neutrality respected, common humanity acknowledged even in the midst of battle. Colette agrees without hesitation. She does not care about nationality. She cares about stopping suffering. German soldiers or American, they all bleed the same, all scream the same, all deserve treatment. She works in the middle of the road, completely exposed, treating casualties while the battle continues around her. Both sides hold their fire, an informal ceasefire arising spontaneously, allowing the crazy French nurse to do her work. She moves from body to body, quickly assessing who can be saved, who is already dead, who needs immediate treatment. The boy with shattered legs, she reaches him first, injects morphine, stops his screaming, gives him peace in his final moments. He dies anyway, blood loss too severe, but he dies without pain, without terror, held by someone who cares. She treats others. An American with a sucking chest wound, a German with his hand blown off, another American with gut wounds that will kill him slowly. She does what she can with limited supplies, limited time, limited ability to truly save anyone. She stabilizes, medicates, comforts. She transforms chaos into something bearable, if only temporarily. When she finishes, when no more wounded remain alive in the road, she stands, gathers her supplies, prepares to continue to the farmhouse. The German lieutenant approaches her, speaks quietly. He thanks her for treating his men. He tells her she is brave, perhaps insane, but brave. He warns her that this informal ceasefire will not last, that fighting will resume momentarily, that she should leave quickly before bullets start flying again. Colette nods, thanks him for his consideration, walks away down the road. Behind her, the battle resumes with full intensity. Machine guns chatter, grenades explode, men die. But Colette is past the German position now, moving toward her destination, closer to the farmhouse with each step. She is exhausted, her supplies depleted, her hands shaking from adrenaline and fear. But she continues. Always she continues. Because men need her. Because this is her purpose. Because on this day, June 6, 1944, she will save every life she possibly can, German or American, friend or enemy, because they are all human beings, all worthy of compassion, all deserving of someone who will try to help them even when help seems impossible. The farmhouse appears ahead, partially visible through morning mist and smoke. Colette increases her pace, moving faster now, knowing she is close, knowing safety and shelter await. She will establish her medical station there. She will treat hundreds of wounded men in the coming hours and days. She will work until her hands bleed, until her body collapses from exhaustion, until no more casualties arrive needing her care. And through it all, she will carry her rage, her grief, her memories of parents and brother lost to this war. But she will not let that rage consume her. She will not become what the war wants her to become, hardened and cruel and indifferent to suffering. Instead, she will transform her rage into something different. Into compassion. Into service. Into dedication to preserving life rather than taking it. Because that is how Colette Rousseau chooses to resist. Not with bombs or bullets, not with violence answered with violence. But with healing. With mercy. With humanity maintained even in the most inhumane circumstances. That is her rebellion. That is her victory. And on this longest day, the day that will decide the fate of Europe, she carries that rebellion forward, one bandage at a time, one saved life at a time, one small act of defiance against the machinery of death that surrounds her. The Sister from Normandy, Act 2, Part 1. Colette Rousseau moved through the tangled terrain, each step bringing her closer to the horrors of the battle raging on the Normandy coast. The sounds of war were all around her, the relentless thundering of artillery, the crackle of machine guns, and the cries of the wounded. With each passing moment, the battle intensified. She was a nurse, not a soldier, but in this moment, she was part of the fight. Her heart, hardened by loss and the years of suffering under German occupation, drove her forward. The plan had been set in motion. The beachhead had been secured, and Colette had been tasked with reaching a farmhouse located 2 kilometers inland from Omaha Beach, where she was to establish a medical station. It wasn't a task for the faint of heart. The road to the farmhouse passed through treacherous terrain, German machine gun positions, minefields, and the ongoing chaos of the invasion. She would have to navigate this battlefield, a place where death was constantly lurking, in order to save as many lives as she could. It had only been minutes since she left the relative safety of the village, but already, Colette had encountered her first casualties. 3 American paratroopers, lying in a ditch by the side of the road. 2 were already dead, their bodies twisted and mangled. The third, a young soldier, was alive but badly wounded. His leg was shattered, and blood soaked through his uniform. Colette knelt beside him, her hands shaking with both fear and purpose. She had no time for hesitation. The young soldier could barely lift his head, his face pale from blood loss. Despite the chaos around them, despite the ongoing battle, Colette worked quickly, tearing away his pant leg, applying pressure to stop the bleeding, and stabilizing the wound with what little she had. She injected him with morphine to dull the pain, doing everything in her power to ensure he would survive, even if just for a little while longer. When the soldier's eyes fluttered open and his lips tried to form words, she shushed him gently, a promise hanging in the air that help would come. She left him with a small canteen of water, instructing him to stay hidden and remain quiet. There was nothing more she could do. The battlefield was alive with gunfire and explosions. Every moment in this hell was a risk, but Colette pressed on. Her path toward the farmhouse became increasingly treacherous. The noise of battle grew louder with every step, and as she moved through the hedgerows and fields, she encountered more casualties. American soldiers pinned down by German fire, some too badly injured to move, others lying dead in the dirt. There were no medics, no safe zones. There was only Colette, moving through the chaos, tending to wounds with what little she had. At one point, she came across a group of soldiers trapped in a drainage ditch, pinned down by German machine gun fire. Colette crawled through the mud, risking everything to help them. Bullets whizzed past, kicking up dirt and sending echoes of violence into the air. The soldiers were stunned by her presence. A woman, in the midst of the chaos, calmly bandaging wounds while the world seemed to fall apart around them. They begged her to leave, to seek safety, but Colette refused. Her mission was to save lives, not to run. As she worked, one of the soldiers provided covering fire, shooting at German positions to suppress their attacks long enough for her to finish. She left the soldiers behind and continued on, knowing that the farmhouse, and her medical station, were still ahead. But the fighting was everywhere, and each step was a gamble. The German machine gun nests had to be avoided, their deadly aim a constant threat. Colette moved through the landscape like a shadow, unseen and unnoticed, her focus only on the wounded men she had yet to reach. Finally, the farmhouse came into view. But as she approached, she heard the unmistakable sound of German machine guns. The path to the house was blocked. 3 German soldiers manned an MG-42, cutting down anyone who dared to approach. The road was littered with bodies, some dead, others crying out for help. Colette's instincts told her to turn back, to find another way, but then the sound of a wounded American soldier calling out for his mother reached her ears. A decision had to be made. A decision that could cost her life. But Colette, driven by an unrelenting need to help, stood up in the open, fully visible to the German gunners. She raised her hands in a universal gesture of peace and surrender, knowing that it might be the last thing she ever did. The machine gun fire paused for a moment. It was all the time she needed. She ran towards the wounded soldier, ignoring the threat of death. She reached him, knelt beside him, and began to work. The bullets resumed their deadly rhythm, but Colette didn't stop. She was saving a life. Colette's resolve was unshakable as she moved forward through the war-torn fields. The decision she had made, risking her life to help the wounded soldier, had momentarily turned the tide of her emotions. But she could not afford to dwell on the fear. There were more lives to save, and she had a mission to complete. The farmhouse was still 200 meters ahead. The sounds of battle raged on around her, deafening in their intensity. The earth trembled beneath her with each artillery shell that exploded nearby. The hedgerows, which had once been comforting and protective, now seemed like traps, hiding German soldiers at every turn, their machine guns waiting to tear into anything that moved. With each step, Colette had to make rapid decisions. She had already treated the first wounded soldier, but she had to press on. Her mind raced as she calculated the quickest path to the farmhouse, watching for any sign of German patrols that could ambush her. She stuck to the shadows as much as possible, ducking behind the cover of the old stone walls, using the dips in the land to her advantage. Then, she heard it, shouting in German, followed by the rapid crack of rifles. Colette froze, her heart pounding in her chest. A German patrol was coming from the far side of the road. They were moving fast, their heavy boots crunching on the gravel. She had seconds to react. The last thing she wanted was to be caught in the open, a civilian medic marked for death by the enemy. She turned, quickly ducking into the long grass beside the road, pressing her body flat against the earth. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she lay still, eyes fixed on the advancing soldiers. They were close, too close. She could hear their conversation, the harshness of their voices cutting through the tension. It felt like hours, but it was only moments before they passed, their footsteps fading into the distance. Colette exhaled, her body trembling with the effort to remain silent and motionless. She waited for several more minutes, listening to the sounds of the battlefield, the gunfire, the cries, before she dared to move again. She crawled forward, the farmhouse now within sight. She finally reached the small, weathered structure, its windows shattered, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. But it was still standing, still intact enough to serve its purpose. Inside, she quickly began setting up the medical station, using the supplies she had carried with her. The widow who had agreed to shelter the station was already inside, her face pale with fear but resolute. Colette worked quickly, knowing that the wounded would soon begin arriving. The first came in less than an hour, a soldier, barely alive, his face pale from blood loss. He had been hit by shrapnel from a nearby explosion. Colette didn't hesitate. She treated him as best she could, stopping the bleeding and stabilizing him, but there was little hope. His injuries were too severe. She gave him morphine, watching as the pain faded from his face, his breathing slowing until he passed away. The hours dragged on. The wounded kept coming, more soldiers, civilians caught in the crossfire, some barely able to move, others already unconscious from shock. Colette worked tirelessly, sewing wounds, setting broken bones, and doing what she could with the meager supplies at her disposal. Every life she saved, every minute she fought to stabilize a soldier, felt like a victory in this chaos. But the battlefield outside was relentless. German forces pushed back against the Allies, and the wounded continued to pour into the farmhouse. Colette's hands were bloodied, her uniform stained, but her determination never faltered. She had not come this far to let the Germans stop her. She had not come this far to fail. As night began to fall, a new group of wounded arrived, their faces pale and hollow, their bodies trembling. Colette's eyes scanned them quickly, assessing their injuries. She had been working for hours without rest, and fatigue was beginning to set in. But she couldn't afford to stop. The farmhouse was crowded with the injured. She couldn't help them all, but she would help as many as she could. In the corner of the room, a soldier, young, no older than 20, looked at her with fear in his eyes. He had been shot in the shoulder, the bullet passing clean through, but his wound was more complicated than it first appeared. Infection had already begun to set in. He needed immediate care, or he would not survive the night. Colette's hands trembled as she set to work. She cleaned the wound as best she could, using what little sterilizing solution she had, and bandaged it tightly. She could feel his pulse weakening as she worked, and she knew that the coming hours would be crucial. She injected him with morphine to ease the pain and settled him down on a cot in the corner, trying to keep him warm. But the soldier wasn't the only one who needed attention. Another soldier, his leg shattered from a mortar blast, had been brought in just moments before. He was in excruciating pain, his body shaking from shock. Colette didn't know how much longer he would last, but she knew that if she didn't work quickly, he too would be lost. The farmhouse was now a makeshift triage center, its floors slick with blood, its walls echoing with the sounds of men in pain. Colette's mind was focused, determined. She had made it this far, and she would see this mission through. Every soldier she helped, every life she saved, was one step closer to the freedom she had longed for. But as the night deepened, the weight of the responsibility was almost too much to bear. She could only hope that, at the end of it all, her efforts would be enough. As the hours passed and more wounded were brought in, Colette's hands never stopped. She had seen the worst of what war could do, but she had also seen the best. In the midst of chaos, humanity still existed. It lived in every soldier she helped, in every small moment of kindness that passed between them. And that, she reminded herself, was what made this war worth fighting. The Sister from Normandy, Act 3, Part 1. The days bled together in the chaos that followed. The early hours of June 7, 1944, marked a turning point, but the battle was far from over. The fighting on the beaches of Normandy had only just begun. Behind the lines, Colette Rousseau and her medical station remained a beacon of hope in a world descending further into madness. Colette had seen horrors. The war had taken so much from her already. Her parents had been lost to a bombing raid, and her brother, Jacques, had been executed by the Gestapo for his work with the resistance. But none of that had prepared her for what she was witnessing now. The faces of the soldiers she treated were still young, many of them younger than her. Yet the weight of the war had aged them all beyond their years. They came to her broken and bleeding, some too far gone to save. She worked tirelessly, not just to save lives, but to stave off the overwhelming sense of helplessness that gnawed at her heart. The farmhouse, once a place of relative calm, had become a symbol of survival. It was overrun with the wounded, Americans, British, and French soldiers, all mixed together in the chaos. The steady stream of men coming through the door only increased as the hours passed. Colette did not hesitate. She had learned to work quickly, using everything at her disposal, morphine, bandages, stolen supplies, to try and keep the wounded alive, but she knew that many would not make it. She had lost count of how many soldiers she had helped, how many she had seen die. Each casualty took its toll on her. Yet she refused to allow herself to break. There was no time for mourning, no time for weakness. She had a duty to perform. The war, however tragic, could not stop for her grief. The farmhouse was crowded, every inch of space taken up by wounded men. Many of them had been transported from the beach, their injuries horrific. Fragments of shells had torn through limbs, while others had been caught in the relentless gunfire. Colette's eyes constantly moved from patient to patient, her hands a blur of action as she worked to stabilize them. Her body ached, her hands trembled, but her will remained strong. As the morning turned to afternoon, she received a report from one of the soldiers in the farmhouse. Word had come that the beach was secure. The Germans had been pushed back, but the cost had been immense. Thousands of soldiers, Allied and German alike, lay dead or wounded. The battle for Normandy had only just begun, and the price of victory was already too high. Colette knew that her work wasn't done yet. The beachhead was secured, but that only meant the war was now moving inland, into the heart of France. The Allies had gained a foothold, but it was fragile. The Germans would not let it go without a fight. And the resistance would continue to play its part, supporting the Allies, sabotaging German supply lines, and helping to liberate the French people. But even as she worked, Colette couldn't help but wonder, how long would it be before this madness reached her doorstep again? How much longer could she go on, treating one soldier after another, watching as they bled and died in her arms? It was a question she could not answer, because the reality of the war was simple, survival was the only option. To think about anything else would be to lose the will to fight. The next few days were a blur. More soldiers arrived at the farmhouse, some barely alive, others already past the point of saving. Colette's focus never wavered, though her energy was beginning to wear thin. She had been working for days without rest, without food, barely able to catch a moment of sleep. But there was always more to do, more people to save. The farmhouse had become a place of refuge, but it was also a place of death. No matter how much she did, no matter how many lives she saved, there was always another soldier who needed her help. Then, on June 10, a change came. Colette had just finished tending to a soldier who had been wounded in the leg when she was approached by one of her fellow resistance members, Antoine. He had been tracking the movement of German forces in the area and had news for her. The Germans were regrouping, reinforcing their positions in the countryside. They were preparing to launch a counterattack, and it would be coming soon. Antoine's face was grim as he spoke. "Colette, we need to move. The German forces will be coming down this road, and we can't stay here. The Allies will need our help, but they won't be able to reach us if we stay here." Colette listened carefully, her mind racing. The farmhouse was no longer safe. The wounded soldiers in her care were at risk of being caught in the crossfire. But she couldn't abandon them, not when so many needed her. "Is there another place?" she asked, her voice tight with determination. Antoine nodded. "We've arranged for a new location, further south. It's not much, but it's better than staying here. We need to move, and we need to move fast." Colette didn't hesitate. She made the decision quickly. The wounded soldiers were her responsibility, and she would not leave them behind. She began organizing the move, directing her fellow volunteers to prepare the wounded for transport. The farmhouse, which had been a place of hope for so many, was now a liability. The Germans would soon be upon them, and there was no time to waste. The soldiers who were able to walk or move were gathered first, helped out of the farmhouse as quickly as possible. Those who were unable to move on their own had to be carried, their wounds stabilized as best as Colette could manage. Every moment counted. The noise of distant gunfire, the sounds of battle on the horizon, served as a constant reminder of how dire their situation had become. It was a race against time. As the last of the wounded soldiers were moved from the farmhouse, Colette took one final look around. The place that had become her refuge, the place where she had fought so hard to save lives, was now empty. The soldiers were gone, and she was left with only the ghosts of the men she had tried to save. The journey to the new location was dangerous. Every field, every road, was fraught with the risk of encountering German patrols. Colette moved quickly, using her knowledge of the terrain to find cover whenever necessary. The soldiers she had saved were exhausted, barely able to keep up, but they had no choice but to press on. It felt like hours before they reached their destination, an old barn that had been converted into a makeshift medical facility. It was nothing compared to the farmhouse, but it would have to do. The barn was cramped, dark, and smelled of hay, but it was safe for the moment. Colette immediately began setting up her medical supplies, preparing for the next wave of wounded soldiers that were sure to arrive. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she took a moment to breathe, to let the exhaustion wash over her. But there was no time for rest. The war was far from over, and Colette knew her part in it had only just begun. The Sister from Normandy, Act 3, Part 2. The barn had become their sanctuary, but even in the dimly lit, cramped space, the sounds of the war outside still managed to seep through. The distant booms of artillery, the sporadic rifle fire, and the muffled cries of soldiers, whether friend or foe, were a constant reminder that the battle for Normandy was far from over. Colette Rousseau, exhausted but determined, continued to do what she had been trained to do, save lives. In the days that followed, the wounded kept arriving. French, American, British soldiers, none of them were spared from the brutality of the conflict. Colette's hands were a blur of action as she treated burns, stab wounds, gunshots, and shrapnel injuries. The barn's walls, covered in a thick layer of hay and dirt, seemed to close in around her as the number of soldiers in need of care grew. The dim light from a few scattered lanterns illuminated her work, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on the battle raging just beyond their temporary refuge, on the lives slipping away as the hours ticked by. The soldiers who came in were battered, bruised, broken, both physically and mentally. Some were able to stand, limping with determination, while others were barely conscious, carried in on stretchers by their comrades. Colette had seen many wounded soldiers before, but never like this. The battle for Normandy had a different quality, a cruelty she hadn't fully understood until now. She worked tirelessly, her body aching, but her spirit unyielding. At night, when the barn fell silent and the wounded soldiers rested, Colette sat alone in a corner, her medical kit beside her. She would sometimes close her eyes for a moment, allowing herself the briefest escape from the harsh reality around her. In those fleeting seconds, she would think of her family, of her parents lost in the bombing raid, of her brother Jacques, who had died at the hands of the Gestapo. They were gone, but their memory fueled her determination to keep going. Every life she saved, every wound she treated, was a small act of defiance against the forces that had taken so much from her. One night, as Colette sat over her medical supplies, wiping her hands on a rag, Antoine approached her. He was one of the resistance leaders she had worked with for years, and his face, usually full of calm resolve, now looked worn, strained. "Colette," he said quietly, "there's something you need to know." Colette's brow furrowed as she looked up. She had seen the tension in Antoine's face many times before, but this was different. She could feel the weight of his words before he even spoke them. "The Germans are regrouping," Antoine continued. "They've managed to push back in some areas, and we've heard reports of a counterattack being planned. The Allies are holding, but it's fragile. We need to prepare for what's coming." Colette nodded, trying to keep her emotions in check. She had known that the Germans would not give up easily. The war was far from won, and the resistance had already sacrificed so much. But to hear it confirmed, that the fight would not end soon, that they would all have to endure even more, was a heavy blow. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the fear rising within her. "Keep treating the wounded," Antoine said. "But we may need to relocate soon. The Germans are getting closer. We don't know how much longer we can keep this place hidden." Colette's heart sank. The barn, their temporary haven, was no longer safe. She had hoped that they could stay longer, that they could continue to help, but it seemed that the relentless march of the war had found them again. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, determination etched into her features. "Then we move. We don't stop. Not now. Not when so many depend on us." For the next few days, Colette and the rest of the resistance members worked feverishly, preparing for the worst. They packed their medical supplies, moved the injured soldiers when possible, and gathered information on the movements of the German forces. Every day, the tension grew, and with it, the knowledge that no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't stop the inevitable. The war would continue, and they would have to adapt, to survive, to fight back however they could. As June 14 approached, the sounds of artillery grew louder, and the Germans' counterattack became more apparent. The Allies had been holding their ground, but the battle for Normandy was far from over. The resistance knew that this moment, this critical juncture in history, would either break the Germans or break the Allies. And Colette? She had no choice but to continue. The war had become part of her very soul. She had lost so much already, but her resolve was unshaken. Every wound she treated, every soldier she helped, was an act of defiance. She could not turn back. The days that followed were a blur of constant movement, the barn now only a temporary stop on the long road to survival. The Allies had pushed forward, but there was still so much ground to cover. The Germans were relentless, their fury undeterred by the losses they had sustained. And in the midst of this chaos, Colette and the resistance continued to fight, not with weapons, but with compassion and care. But there was something else, something lurking in the back of Colette's mind. The war had changed her. It had forced her to confront the darkest parts of herself, the parts that longed for vengeance, that burned with anger over the injustices done to her and her family. Yet, despite the pain and the loss, she had found something in herself that she hadn't known existed. She had found the strength to care, to heal, to keep going. As the days turned to weeks, and the war raged on, Colette continued to fulfill her duty. She was a nurse, yes, but she was also something more. She was a symbol of hope, of resistance, of life amidst the death that surrounded her. Every soldier she saved, every wound she bandaged, was a small victory. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would continue to fight in her own way. The Germans would not break her. The war would not break her. She would continue to heal, to fight, to endure, until the day that victory finally arrived. And when that day came, Colette would stand tall, knowing that she had done everything in her power to save those who had fought for freedom, for hope, for the future. But that day was still far off. And until it arrived, Colette would keep fighting, one soldier at a time.